Hello, and welcome. Settle in. Get comfortable. Perhaps you have a warm drink. Perhaps the world outside your window is quiet and dark. Perfect. Because tonight, we're not telling a fairy tale of daring knights and damsels in distress. We're telling a much more practical, and frankly, far more interesting story. It's a kind of bedtime story for the historically curious. A how-to guide from a time long past. Our topic: how to build a medieval army. Now, I want you to clear your mind of a very particular, very pervasive image. It's the one you've seen in countless movies and storybooks. A noble king, resplendent in impossibly shiny armor, stands on his balcony and declares war. In the next scene, a vast, orderly army of equally shiny knights appears as if by magic, their loyal peasant servants trailing behind with pitchforks and boundless enthusiasm. It's clean. It's simple. It's heroic. And it is, almost entirely, wrong. The reality was infinitely messier, more complex, and more human. Assembling a medieval army wasn't like ordering a pizza, it was like trying to organize the world's most dangerous, ill-tempered and logistically nightmarish music festival, where every single roadie, musician and security guard has a sword and a grievance. It was a monumental undertaking that relied on a fragile web of obligation, personal loyalty, cold, hard cash, and a healthy dose of fear. So tonight, we're going to be the project managers for this chaotic enterprise. We're going to follow the process, step by step, for raising an army in high to late medieval Europe, specifically for an offensive campaign, the most ambitious and difficult type of war. We won't be talking about a desperate castle defense or a quick border skirmish between two grumpy barons. We're talking about a king deciding he wants a piece of his neighbor's kingdom and the colossal effort required to make that happen. So, let's step back in time. Imagine you are that king. You have ambition. You have a crown, and you have a map with a part you'd very much like to recolor in your favor. What is your very first move? It's not a declaration of war. It's a dinner party. Step 1. Spread the word. The first, and most crucial, ingredient in the recipe for war is time. A king who woke up one sunny May morning and spontaneously decided to invade France would find himself invading with little more than his personal bodyguards and a few confused cooks. A proper war was a slow brewing storm, and the seeds of a summer campaign were sown in the cold, dark soil of the preceding winter. The process often began unofficially, in the warm, firelit halls of the royal court during a major festival. Christmas was a popular choice. This was no mere holiday, celebration. It was a political Super Bowl. All the major players of the realm, the great dukes, the powerful archbishops, the earls and the barons are gathered in one place. They came to see and be seen, to renew oaths of loyalty, to gossip, to jockey, the favour, and to feast at the king's expense. And the king, ever the master of ceremonies, would use this captive audience for a bit of strategic soft launching. Picture the scene. The great hall is roaring with the sounds of 100 conversations, the clatter of plates, the music of lutes and pipes. The air is thick with the smell of roast meats, mulled wine, and wood smoke. At the high table, the king leans over to his most powerful magnate, a man whose lands are so vast he's practically a king himself. Under the cover of the noise, between bites of venison pie, the king would murmur his intentions. "My dear Duke," he might say, "I find my thoughts have been turning to Gascony of late. The weather there is said to be lovely in the summer. And their wine. Exquisite. It seems a shame it is not our wine." This was not a command. It was a feeler, a piece of high-stakes political theatre. The Duke, a man who could make or break this entire venture, would nod thoughtfully. He wouldn't be surprised. He'd have heard the rumours, whispered down the political grapevine for weeks. His response, whether an enthusiastic grin or a carefully neutral, "Indeed, Your Majesty, a fascinating region," would tell the king much of what he needed to know. The king would repeat this process with his other key tenants-in-chief, the top layer of his power pyramid. This was the focus group phase. He was gauging their mood, planting the idea, and giving them the most valuable commodity of all, a heads-up. These powerful men would then travel back to their own vast estates, carrying this royal suggestion with them. Now, the message began its slow cascade downwards. The Duke would hold his own court, perhaps at Easter, and inform his own subordinate barons and knights of the king's potential interest in a summer excursion. The news would spread, not as a formal declaration, but as a weighty rumour, allowing everyone to begin the arduous process of preparation. Why all this lead time? Because war in the Middle Ages was strictly seasonal, dictated not by strategy, but by weather and biology. Campaigning in winter was, for the most part, suicidal. The single greatest enemy of any medieval army was not the opposing force, but the environment itself. Let's talk about mud. It sounds trivial, but it was the great arbiter of medieval logistics. The rudimentary roads of Europe, often little more than dirt tracks, would turn into impassable rivers of thick, clinging mud from the autumn rains to the spring thaw. A supply wagon, the lifeblood of any army, could sink up to its axles, immobilizing an entire column. Horses, the engines of war, could break their legs in the treacherous terrain. An army on the march could be brought to a complete standstill, not by a fortress, but by a soggy field. Then there was the issue of sustenance. An army, as the saying goes, marches on its stomach. But more accurately, a medieval army marched on the stomach of its horses. A single warhorse, a destrier, required a huge amount of fodder and grain every single day. Multiply that by thousands of horses for knights, squires, mounted archers, and supply-train sand, you have a logistical demand of staggering proportions. In the spring and summer, an army could, to some extent, live off the land, grazing its animals on meadows. In winter, this was impossible. All fodder had to be carried with them, or requisitioned from already bare peasant granaries, an unsustainable task in hostile territory. And finally, there was disease. Before the age of antibiotics, a simple infection could be a death sentence. Gathering thousands of men and animals into crowded, unsanitary camps was to create a perfect petri dish for pestilence. In the cold, damp conditions of winter, respiratory illnesses would scythe through the ranks. Dysentery, the dreaded bloody flux, was a constant and deadly companion, often killing more soldiers than enemy swords ever would. A wise king knew that. Launching a winter campaign was to invite defeat by fever and starvation before a single battle was fought. So, everyone had the winter to prepare. The knights would check their armor for rust and weak points. The blacksmiths would be working overtime, forging arrowheads, shoeing horses, and repairing swords. The lords would be trying to figure out the most difficult part of all, how to pay for everything. And they waited. They waited for the ground to harden, for the first shoots of grass to appear, and for the official, formal call to arms. This typically came about 2 months before the planned assembly date. A document, carefully penned by scribes in the royal chancellery, would be sealed with the king's own great seal, a symbol of undeniable authority. This wasn't a rumour anymore. This was a legal order. These letters were dispatched by royal messengers, who would ride day and night to deliver them to that top tier of the pyramid, the archbishops, the dukes, the masters of knightly orders, and key royal officials. The letter was simple and direct. It named the purpose of the war, and it gave a time and a place for the army to assemble. For our hypothetical king, it might read, "To our trusted and beloved Duke of Normandy, be it known that we intend to prosecute our rightful claim to the lands of Gascony. You are hereby summoned to appear, with all your contractually obligated forces, at the city of Amiens on the feast day of St. John the Baptist." The clock was now officially ticking. The moment that Duke received the letter, the real work began. He had roughly 60 days to transform a piece of parchment into a fully armed, funded, and mobile fighting force. And his first and most important method for doing this was to pull on the levers of a system we now call feudalism. Step 2, vertical recruitment. If the medieval power structure was a pyramid, then vertical recruitment was the system of signals and obligations that flowed down its sides. It was the primary method for raising the most prestigious, most expensive, and most critical part of any army, the heavy cavalry, the men-at-arms. Think of it less as a formal recruitment drive and more as a high-stakes, violent, multi-level marketing scheme. At the very top was the king, the ultimate landowner. In theory, he owned everything. He granted huge parcels of land, called fiefs, to his most important followers, the tenants-in-chief. In our example, our Duke of Normandy is one such man. In exchange for this land, which made him fabulously wealthy and powerful, he owed the king service. This wasn't just a vague promise of friendship, it was a binding contract. He had to provide counsel, attend the king's court, and, most importantly, provide military service. The contract was specific. He owed the king a set number of trained, armed, and mounted fighters, a contingent for a certain number of days per year, typically 40. The size of this contingent varied wildly based on the size and wealth of the fief. A minor baron might owe only 5 knights. Our powerful Duke of Normandy might be on the hook for 100 men-at-arms, or even more. Now, a savvy magnate would often show up with more men than was strictly required. This wasn't just generosity. It was a power move. Arriving at the muster point with an oversized, splendidly equipped retinue was the medieval equivalent of pulling up to a business meeting in a Bugatti. It was a declaration of wealth, power, and loyalty, a clear signal to both the king and rival lords that you were a force to be reckoned with. This system of obligation based on land grants is what historians often call the feudal levy. The term itself is a bit anachronistic, as the neat, tidy system we imagine often only truly solidified in the later Middle Ages. The historian Guy Halsall offers a more encompassing term, vertical recruitment, which perfectly captures any form of recruitment based on a lord-vassal relationship, a personal chain of loyalty stretching from the highest duke down to the lowliest knight. So, our duke has his orders from the king. His first problem is financial. Leading a retinue to war was ruinously expensive. He had to pay for his own magnificent armour, his horses plural, as they were often killed, his tents, his personal supplies, and the wages for any men not directly covered by a feudal obligation. This meant liquidating assets, taking out loans from Italian bankers and squeezing his estates for every last silver coin. He also had to make administrative preparations for his absence. He would be gone for months, maybe even more than a year if the campaign dragged on. He needed to appoint trusted administrators to run his lands, collect taxes, and dispense justice while he was away. Choosing the right people was critical. An incompetent or treacherous steward could ruin him back home while he was busy fighting abroad. His most important task, however, was to assemble the men. For an offensive war like this, he couldn't just grab every able-bodied man on his lands. That was for a desperate defense of the homeland. For a foreign adventure, he needed quality. He needed skilled, reliable, and motivated fighters. This selection process was also a delicate political balancing act. His vassals and knights were not mindless drones. They were his constituents. Some, particularly younger knights, would be chomping at the bit for a chance at glory, honour, and, most importantly, plunder. Others, older men with families and profitable estates, might be far less enthusiastic about risking their lives in a foreign field for the king's ambition. The Duke had to manage these competing interests, persuading the reluctant and tempering the over-eager. The core of his fighting force, his retinue, came from his own household. This was not just a collection of servants. It was a military and administrative headquarters on the move. It was divided into 2 broad categories. First, the non-combatants, though even that term is fluid. This included a whole host of essential personnel, cooks to turn foraged scraps into edible meals, wagoners to manage the lumbering supply train, scribes to keep meticulous records of expenses and payroll, blacksmiths and armourers to perform constant repairs, and grooms to care for the priceless horses. He would also have doctors and surgeons, often hired externally, whose grim work with saws and cauterizing irons was a terrifying but necessary part of warfare. Then there were the combatants drawn from the household. These were the professionals. His personal bodyguards, the soldiers of his house guard, the mesney, and weapons instructors formed the elite corps. But many others, with non-military titles, were also expected to fight. His chief administrators, his advisors, even his master of the hunt, were all men of high social standing who were expected to don armour and take their place in the battle line. Their office was a privilege that came with the responsibility of armed service. But even with all these household members, our Duke would almost certainly not have enough men to meet his quota for the king. This is where the multi-level marketing scheme kicks in. Just as the king had granted the Duke a fief, the Duke himself had granted smaller parcels of his own land to lesser barons and knights. These men were his vassals. Now, he called in his own debts. He sent out his own summons, repeating the process on a smaller scale. To my loyal Sir Reginald of the Misty Fen, his message might read, "As I am summoned to the king's service in Gascony, so I summon you. Present yourself at my castle, with 2 men-at-arms and 5 archers, by the end of the month." Sir Reginald, in turn, might have a small piece of land head granted to a trusted man-at-arms who owed him service. And so the chain of obligation, the order summons, cascaded downwards. The king calls the Duke calls the baron, the Baron, all's the knight. Theoretically, this could go on indefinitely, but historians like Clifford Rogers note that a chain longer than 4 levels was rare. Even this was often not enough. What if a key vassal had recently died, and his heir was a child? What if another claimed illness? What if some simply refused? In these cases, the Duke had to get creative to fill his ranks. He might turn to relatives and allies who were not his direct vassals, but who might be persuaded to join for a share of the potential profits. And if he had the cash, he had a final, powerful option. He could hire mercenaries to make up the shortfall. Meanwhile, all the men who had been summoned, from the wealthy baron to the simple man-at-arms, were preparing themselves. The most, their fief, their parcel of land, was their payment. Therefore, they were expected to finance their own equipment. And the cost was staggering. A full suit of plate armour in the late Middle Ages could cost as much as a small farm. A good warhorse was the equivalent of a luxury car today, and a knight needed at least 2 or 3. Add to that the cost of lances, swords, daggers, a helmet, a shield and provisions for the march, and you can see why the primary motivation for many was the hope of capturing a wealthy opponent to hold for ransom. Let's zoom in on the contingent of an average baron, a subordinate of our duke. It was a miniature army in itself. According to Clifford Rogers, it might number around 50 men and 100 horses. This wouldn't be 50 knights. It might be 3 knights and 9 squires or sergeants, the aspiring knights and professional non-noble heavy cavalry. Each of these men-at-arms would have his own retinue. A knight didn't just show up by himself. He brought a page, a young boy who acted as his personal assistant, polished his armour, and ran messages. He also brought his own soldiers. In later English armies, for example, a man-at-arms was typically accompanied by a mounted archer and a few other servants or foot soldiers. These men had a dual function. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also the support staff. They pitched the tents, foraged for food and firewood, and cared for their master's precious horses and equipment. The feudal levy, this intricate vertical system of obligation, formed the heart and soul of the army. It provided the shock troops, the armoured cavalry that could break an enemy line. It was the source of the army's leadership and its most professional warriors. But it was only one piece of the puzzle. An army of only knights is an unbalanced, inflexible thing. To create a truly effective fighting force, our king needed infantry. Lots of it. And for that, he had to cast his net much, much wider. Step 3. Horizontal recruitment. If vertical recruitment was about calling in personal debts from the elite, horizontal recruitment was about calling on the general population. This was the king appealing directly to his free subjects, not through the pyramid of vassalage, but through his royal authority as the sovereign of the realm. This was the primary method for raising large numbers of infantrymen, the backbone of any successful army. Unlike the personal, sealed letters sent to the magnates, a horizontal call to arms was a public proclamation. It couldn't be delivered individually. Instead, the king's orders were sent to his local officials spread throughout the kingdom. In England, these would be the sheriffs; in France, the bailiffs; in the towns of the Holy Roman Empire, the mayors and city councillors. These officials were then responsible for promulgating the king's command within their jurisdiction. In times of emergency, like a sudden invasion, this call could be dramatic and immediate, a frantic ringing of church bells or the lighting of signal beacons on hilltops. But for our planned offensive campaign, the process was more orderly. The sheriff would read the proclamation in the market square of every major town in his county. The theoretical basis for this was the long-held principle that all free men had a duty to defend the realm. From the 12th century onwards, it was common for laws to be enacted that legally required every freeman fit for service to own and maintain weaponry and armour proportionate to his wealth. In England, the famous Assize of Arms of 1181 codified this, specifying exactly who should have what. A wealthy man needed a full hauberk of mail, a helmet, a shield, and a lance. A poorer man might only be required to have a leather jerkin, a helmet, and a spear. To ensure compliance and to keep the population in a state of some military readiness, local officials would hold periodic musters or views of arms. These were part public inspection, part county fair. The men of the district would assemble on the village green or a designated field, bringing their required gear. The sheriff or a commissioner of array would inspect them, making notes of who was properly equipped and who was not. These events often included archery competitions and military drills, keeping skills sharp and fostering a sense of communal martial identity. Because of this existing framework, when the king needed to raise an army, he could tap into a pre-existing pool of armed men very quickly. The royal official, the commissioner of array, would assemble the men of the county, typically all those aged between 16 and 60. From this large group, they would then select the number of soldiers required by the king's order. An order from King Edward III of England, a master of this type of recruitment, gives us a perfect glimpse of the mechanism. He ordered his commissioners in Nottinghamshire to array all men aged 16 and 60 in the county, horsemen as well as footmen, and put them into thousands, hundreds and twenties, and from them then select 500 archers and 200 hobblers light horsemen from among the strongest and fittest of the men of the said county. The order specified the strongest and fittest. The reality on the ground was often more nuanced. The commissioners were local men, deeply embedded in the society they were recruiting from. They knew the families. They knew that one man was the sole support for his widowed mother, that another was a notorious troublemaker the village would be glad to see the back of. Consequently, the selection process often came down to who was most willing to go, rather than who was objectively the strongest. Some men, fired by tales of adventure or a desire to escape a dead-end life, would volunteer eagerly. Others would be volunteered by their village. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing for the king. A motivated volunteer, even if slightly smaller, was almost always a better soldier than a resentful, physically powerful conscript who would desert at the first opportunity. Recognizing this, it was sometimes possible for a man who was selected to pay a fee, known as scutage or a commutation fine, in lieu of personal service. This money could then be used to hire a willing and capable replacement. The quality of troops raised this way was, to put it mildly, variable. You might get a contingent of sturdy yeomen, expert archers who had practiced every Sunday after church their entire lives. You might also get a group of poorly equipped farm hands, whose main military skill was being able to stand in a line without falling over. Their motivation and discipline were often questionable, and coordinating thousands of these men, who spoke with different dialects and had no experience of military life, was a logistical headache. For this reason, these mass levies were often used for short-term service and primarily for defense within their home region. However, there were crucial exceptions, especially for offensive warfare. The legendary English longbowmen who dominated the battlefields of the 100 Years' War were a product of this horizontal recruitment. They were not nobles, but they were highly trained, specialists, and the crown invested heavily in recruiting and equipping them. Another powerful example comes from urban centres. The citizen militias of the wealthy cloth towns of Flanders or the bustling city-states of Italy were not to be underestimated. These were not rustic peasants. They were proud, well-fed, and often excellently equipped craftsmen and merchants, fighting to protect their city's trade and autonomy. The militias of Ghent or Florence were formidable fighting forces, well-drilled and fiercely motivated by civic pride. A wise king would not turn his nose up at a contingent of these men. Once selected, these horizontally recruited troops were not simply told to walk to France. The local community had a responsibility to see them off properly. They were often provided with a uniform coat, a simple tunic of a specific colour to identify their origin. For example, the men from Norwich in 1385 wore coats of red and white. This was one of the earliest forms of military uniform, crucial for identification in the chaos of battle. They also received conduct money, pay to cover their food and expenses for the march from their home county to the designated army assembly point. With their new coats and a little coin in their pockets, these contingents of archers, spearmen and light cavalry began their own journey to the muster, a stream of humanity flowing towards the great river of the main army. The king now had his noble heavy cavalry and his massed infantry. The army was taking shape, but it still had gaps. Step 4. Fill your ranks even with the intricate web of vertical obligation and the wide net of horizontal recruitment. A king's army was often still not large enough or possessed of the right mix of skills for the ambitious campaign he had planned. The final step was to supplement his forces with external contingents, the freelancers, the specialists, and the foreign partners. This meant tapping into two main sources, the troops of allies and dependents, and the volatile but effective world of mercenaries. First, let's consider allies and dependents. No kingdom was an island. The king's power and influence often extended beyond his formal borders. He might have smaller, dependent territories that owed him tribute or military aid. For the kings of England, Wales was a prime example. While often rebellious, the Welsh were famed for their mastery of the longbow. English kings frequently compelled or paid Welsh lords to provide large contingents of these expert archers for their campaigns in France. They were specialists, bringing a skill set that was in high demand. Allies were another key component. A war against France, for instance, was a great opportunity for the Duke of Burgundy or the Count of Flanders, traditional rivals of the French crown, to join in. These alliances were fragile and opportunistic, sealed with treaties, promises of shared plunder, and strategic marriages. An allied contingent would arrive as a self-contained army, with its own lords, its own command structure, and its own agenda. Integrating them into the main force was a delicate diplomatic challenge for the king, who had to act as both a supreme commander and a careful negotiator. The French, for their part, frequently made use of their old alliance with Scotland to distract the English with a war on their northern border. They also famously hired Geno's crossbowmen. The men of Geno were the undisputed masters of the crossbow, a powerful but slow-loading weapon. They were hired out as complete, professional units, led by their own captains, and provided the French armies with a crucial ranged capability to counter the English longbow. This brings us to the most notorious and often most effective type of soldier, the mercenary. By the 13th and 14th centuries, warfare had become a business, and there were many highly organized companies of professional soldiers who sold their services to the highest bidder. These were the Free Companies, with formidable names like the Great Company or the White Company, led by legendary mercenary captains like Sir John Hawkwood. Hiring mercenaries was like buying a top-of-the-line product off the shelf. You weren't recruiting individuals, you were hiring a pre-existing, battle-hardened, and well-equipped fighting unit. These men were the ultimate professionals. They feared no enemy and were loyal to no king or country, only to the contract and the coin. They were often the most disciplined and effective troops on the battlefield. They knew their business, whether it was storming a castle, executing a complex maneuver, or just standing firm against a cavalry charge. However, they came with significant downsides. First, they were incredibly expensive. Their price was exorbitant, and they demanded to be paid on time. If the money ran out, they had a tendency to become insubordinate, desert, or even switch sides to the enemy if offered a better deal. Second, they were a plague upon the land. When not on campaign, they would often terrorize the civilian population, living by extortion and plunder. They were a necessary evil, a tool that a king used when he needed guaranteed results and had the treasury to afford it. But inviting a large mercenary company into your army was like welcoming a pack of trained but hungry wolves into your camp. You had to handle them with extreme care. With these additional troops, specialist allied contingents, and the hardened mercenary companies, all the major sources of soldiers had been tapped. The streams and rivers of recruits were now converging on the designated assembly point. Conclusion: the army assembled. Imagine, now, the scene at that assembly point, perhaps a wide plain outside a city like Amiens. For weeks, the roads have been choked with columns of men. The vertically recruited retinues arrive in style, banners fluttering, armor gleaming, a dazzling display of aristocratic power. Horizontally recruited infantrymen shuffle in, wearing their simple county-coloured coats, looking around with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The Welsh archers chatter in their own tongue, and the grim-faced German or Italian mercenaries set up their own well-ordered camp, keeping to themselves. The plain is transformed into a sprawling, chaotic city of tents. The air fills with a cacophony of sounds, the ring of 1,000 blacksmiths' hammers, the neighing of tens of thousands of horses, the shouts of sergeants drilling their squads, the babble of a dozen different languages and dialects. The smell is a unique and potent cocktail of wood smoke, sweat, horse manure, and cooking food. This is not the neat, orderly army of the storybooks. This is a patchwork quilt of humanity, a temporary and volatile society stitched together from 1,000 different threads of obligation, ambition, cash, and desperation. And now, our king, the man who started this all with a quiet word at a Christmas feast, rides through the camp. He looks upon his creation, the proud duke who owes him service for his land, the young knight hoping for glory, the peasant archer hoping for a few silver coins, the cynical mercenary captain who sees only a business opportunity. To mould this disparate, motley collection of individuals into a single, effective fighting force will be his greatest challenge. The planning is over. The recruitment is done. The long and arduous march to the battlefield is about to begin. And that, as they say, is a story for another night. So should you ever find yourself planning to raise your own army in the near future, Do remember that modern tenants are rarely obligated to provide armed service for their landlords. Please use the information we've provided responsibly. And, perhaps, consider supporting our historical endeavours, so we can continue to bring these stories from the past to life. Good night.